Welcome to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. This is an initiative by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. As you are aware, we are in a series of lectures collectively entitled Cultural Studies. We have already completed 3 modules and part of module 4, which is our last module, and today we are in lecture 6 of the last module, which is entitled Science, Technology and Cultural Studies. As always, let us do a recap of what we did in the last lecture. The last few lectures, you would remember, were devoted to largely to media, to cultural forms, to cultural industry, to television. Okay. Today we are going to go into another dimension or another area within this module, but let us do a recap of new media, which was our topic of discussion in the last lecture. And we saw in the lecture on new media, we saw after Lev Manovich in his book The Language of New Media, that new media may be differentiated from the so called older media by one important fact, and that is new media are the cultural objects which use digital computer technology for distribution and exhibition, meaning it should not be only for storage purposes. Okay? Even old media use such technology for purposes of storing data, but there should be an exhibition or using digital computer technology, and also importantly there has to be an element of interactiveness that is allowed by the new media. Then we found that some of these interactive communication forms, okay, include, among other things, the blogs that you read, the podcasts, the social network sites which are very popular, the RSS feeds that you receive, the wikis and the hypertext, where we know that hypertext is, how is it interactive? It is interactive because it allows you to comment, okay, and annotate an already existing original text. And so what are the things that are, or forms that are not included in the new media? Those forms, media forms that are not included in the new media are television programs. Look at this slide please. Television programs, feature films, magazines, books, and the important point here being that computing for production and storage are used all right, but not for final distribution. Then we also found that mass media and new media may be termed or may be described also from the point of view of the nature of their industry, and these are that mass media is to do with modern industry, with standardized goods, homogeneous consumers, right, which has, as we found in the last few lectures, devoted to media forms, cultural industry, which have received a good amount of critique from scholars. The new media is to do with postmodern industry, where we have segmented goods and segmented audiences instead of homogeneous goods and audiences. This also gives rise, as we saw in the last lecture, to new modes of production and new regimes of work. Fine. So, I hope this brief recap, by new media, we have already touched upon some of the things that are going to come up in our next few lectures, which is science and technology, cyber culture, etc. Okay. So, we are well within, the new media is really sort of bridging the gap between old media and science and technology. So, this lecture is entitled Science, Technology and Cultural Studies. Many of you may be aware of STS, which is Science, Technology and and Society, that is the sociological exploration of science and technology, also as many call techno science. Okay. So, what are we doing here? Are we simply repeating what STS tells us, or social studies or of science and technology tell us. We are not exactly doing this, and as we saw with other forms of culture and media and other domains, you will find that also here also we are trying to really carve out a niche for cultural studies and to show you the difference between a cultural studies exploration of science and technology and an STS exploration of science and technology. So, as always, let us declare the key source texts in this lecture. There are many books, of course, that we can use when we talk about science, technology and culture, right, or even science, technology and society, but for the purposes of this lecture, I shall be bringing in essays on science, technology and society and culture, which are included, for instance, in Toby Miller's edited volume, A Companion to Cultural Studies, and Simon Deering's Cultural Studies Reader. Fine. So, before we move into the cultural analysis, okay, of science and technology, very briefly let us talk about a domain with which we happen to contrast it, that is STS or science, technology and society. STS has as its objective, of course, science and technology. Its method is an empirical one, okay, where there is an investigation of the practices, workings and materialities of science and technology. For instance, Laboratory Life, for instance, by Bruno Latour is one seminal book in this domain, as also so many other books that he has written. We are looking at the practices done by carried out by scientists in their laboratory. We are trying to look at the laboratory not as a neutral place, we are trying to look at the laboratory as a cultural space, okay, and the meanings that emanate, the methods that are used are put into scrutiny. And many say, that's point number 3, many say that the methodology is quite akin to an ethnographic one. Okay. Now, why did we require social studies of of science and technology, or STS, or now today contemporary cultural studies of science and technology? Now, this was largely as a reaction to a school of thought, okay, or a movement, so to speak, in science and technology, which was known as Positivism. Okay. So, let us look first at what this movement was, against which we find a scrutiny, okay, an imperative in scholars to scrutinize, okay, the workings of scientists, to scrutinize the philosophy of the philosophy of science helps us to scrutinize these things. So, first we are going to therefore look at Positivism as a school. Now, as a movement, Positivism looks at science as distinct from other areas of human creativity. Science under Positivism is something that is sacrosanct, right? The activities of scientists are sacrosanct activities. After all, why? Because they are supposed to give us, quote unquote, the truth, right? So, science was therefore demarcated as a distinct or an activity distinct from other areas of human creativity. This also meant that perhaps we could not receive, apart from religion maybe, particularly in the 19th century and in some cases even today, science was seen as the domain that could give us truths, right, and hence the word positive, okay, positivistic. Second, they also saw science as having a methodical uniqueness, a methodological uniqueness, sorry. So, this methodological uniqueness was seen to be something that only science had. Okay, it was sort of the it was the precious tool of the scientists, and this uniqueness was also found, believed to be one that was again sacrosanct and one that could not be questioned. Why? Because after all, scientists were trying to give us the truth. Then there was an infallibility about science and monism. There was an observation, there was an understanding of observation as being theory independent, okay, that theory would not color empirical observations of scientists, right. And the facts that were given by scientists were also claimed at least to be value neutral under a positivist framework. In that sense, the narrative therefore that comes to us of science is one that is progressive and one that is linear. The belief within this framework is this, that science gets better and better, with time. Science is progressive in the sense that knowledge grows progressively almost in a linear fashion, okay. So, which meant that yesterday's science cannot be better than today's science. So, you see this was this kind of thinking about science which we called not simply science, of course, even other domains, social sciences, we call positivism, and a sort of radical positivism was what propelled the study of the social study of science and technology. Before this, we did have since the Greek times, we did have the philosophy of science being a very important part, so much so that many do not want to sort of want to demarcate two separate areas of philosophy of science and sociology of science. Okay. Now, together if you look at it in a liberal sense, together the philosophy of science, the sociology of science and the cultural studies exploration of science form a very important, a very powerful domain in critiquing of both axioms and postulates in science of, as it said, mentioned here, infallibility as far as science is concerned, and cultural studies you could, very safely say is the latest entry into this critical enterprise. Right. One of the first you could say premises or key premises in this way of looking at science and technology, that is the cultural way of looking at science and technology, is that A, science is socially determined, and B, science is culturally specific. Okay. Now, if many would not agree with such a postulate, how can science be socially determined? But we shall see in a while, for example, taking the example of Newton's Principia, we shall see how science is also socially determined. Science is also culturally specific in the sense that science also partakes of the signifying practices that are available or that are sort of in currency, the signs and the meanings that are in general currency in general culture. Okay. Now, if we have to look specifically, or if you ask me, what does cultural studies specifically look at as far as science and technology are concerned? A is, there may be three different ways. Okay. A, we see science itself as a culture. Okay. We see science. Now, if culture is defined as a way of life, as we saw in our initial lectures, if culture is defined as a way of life, then science and the scientists, okay, are said to be also in a way of life. So, science or doing science becomes a way of life with its own practices, with its own codes and meanings, with its own vanguards, so to speak, and its own watchdogs, right. So, as we found, A, science as culture is the first way of looking at science by cultural studies. Second, science and technology or techno-science, which many people use the word techno-science today, okay, saying that science and technology can really not be separated. So, science and technology or techno-science is seen as also shaping culture. That is the second way of looking at science and technology from a cultural studies perspective. And science and culture, okay, third, science and culture are also seen as creating cultures of science, right. Now, for for scholars, for instance, like Bruno Latour and others, this is for them most important, okay? The cultures of science. Now, by cultures of science, we do not mean only the practices of scientists, we certainly also do not mean only the laboratory life. What we mean is the system of codes and the way scientific statements are encoded and the way scientists and students are taught to decode those signs. Okay. There are also how diagrams, graphs, which are not in in language, right, mathematical equations, how they also are brought in the enterprise of science. Okay. So, the cultures of science would range from the epistemological, right, down to the actual effect that science has on society. Okay. So, now you are aware that if you are asked what are the aspects, the key aspects that are taken up in a cultural studies understanding of science, then we would say that these are A, science as culture, science and technology as shaping culture, and the cultures that are established by scientific practices. Fine. As I said a while ago, we would be looking at an example of how science impacts culture, how science is socially determined, how it is culturally specific. Now, this was given to us by a Russian scholar named Boris Hessen. Okay. Hessen talks about Newton's Principia, and many of us would simply look at Newton's Principia in a in the way science was conceived of earlier, at least by the majority of people, as value neutral, okay, science as sort of isolated from all social and cultural processes, right. Hessen, on the other hand, says that Newton's Principia, apart from being a scientific and mathematical text, okay, it was related to, if you look at it from the point of view of being affected by by socio-political events, affected by the sort of what we call the zeitgeist, in German the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age, then he says that we have also to look at Newton's Principia as serving the interests of British mercantile capitalism. Okay. How it was seen as both emanating from, okay, this is important, this is seen as both emanating from and contributing to issues and facilities of transportation, of communication, and of the military, right, of British mercantile capitalism. So, there are already available many explorations, social cultural explorations, for instance, of Galileo and his times, okay, of Einstein, of quantum mechanics, etc., from a cultural studies perspective, right. I can give you a second example here. When you talk about colonial science, on the first example, we were given the example by Boris Hessen of Newton's Principia. In this, we also look at how colonial science, okay, because of post-colonialism, because of colonial theory, philosophy and methodology, okay, today we can look back and talk about colonial science, at least as it was given to us in our country, okay, as deeply as not something that was again value neutral, as not something which was sort of untouched, right, by the bigger and the grander framework of colonialism and what it stood for. Okay. So, colonial science interfaces with issues of race, with issues of class, of gender and nation, and in India perhaps even caste, right, and of course, with the broader understanding of what colonial knowledge was all about. Okay. How for instance, the natives were considered in the colonial setup. Right. So, we have two examples here of how science and technology are both socially determined and culturally specific. So, the origins of cultural studies, as a domain itself, it is interesting, okay, how it is related. Now, we have always spoken of cultural studies as as something that was something that came about with the establishment of the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, okay, with very important scholars like Raymond Williams, Richard Hoggard, and then Stuart Hall. Many of these directors of the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies. But if we look at it from an epistemological standpoint, right, this is what we also have to acknowledge, and it really ties in and helps us understand why cultural studies is important, the way cultural studies came about as a reaction to something. So, what was cultural studies a reaction against? Okay, among other things, that it was a reaction against racial domination, that it was a reaction against scholars who refused to understand the politics of difference. Feminism being also a very important contributor to cultural studies, and of course, structuralism, particularly as we understand semiological criticism in the encoding and decoding of science. These are the two important, also additional important, and as I mentioned earlier, epistemologically these are very important. Why? Because cultural studies is often, that cultural studies is, among all other domains, is akin to sociology. So much so that many say that there is no need, okay, for cultural studies, because sociology kind of embraces, okay, many of the areas that are discussed under cultural studies. Now, obviously cultural studies as a domain has striven, has made all attempts to carve out its own niche, to say that no, we are a different domain altogether, we may be akin, because if you remember the first lecture or first or second lecture in this series, okay, we had talked about, we have discussed the sheer interdisciplinary character or nature of cultural studies, and we had said that many even call it a post-disciplinary enterprise, right. So, in that sense, okay, we could say that it is quite legitimate for cultural studies to, if not to borrow, then to carry on or to extend some of the domains of study and exploration that have been there hitherto in areas, more established areas like sociology or anthropology. Okay. So, it is called, let us look at this slide please, it is called often an insurgent sociology, okay, that is a domain that rebelled against a particular way of looking at society, which was called the functionalist way, okay, to see the different parts of society, to see different institutions of society, like say family, like education, to when we look at these simply in their in the functions, okay, as the functions that they perform, okay, there is an additional, or maybe you could say a concurrent tendency, right, to look at these very functions as given, things that are already given, things without which you cannot carry on. So, if certain institutions have served purposes in the past, then these are institutions that are almost naturalized. So, cultural studies, because it is politically driven, because it looks at issues of power and the politics of difference, okay, sort of rebelled against this very notion of functionalism. This notion of functionalism is also positivist in its epistemology, making in that sense, or also showing that if science is value neutral, then those things which have been functional in society can also perhaps be value neutral. This is what, or this was one of the motivations among others, okay, for many scholars moving into, now many scholars moving from literature, for instance, to cultural studies, many people, scholars moving from sociology, anthropology to cultural studies. One of the reasons could have may be, it is not to say that there is no dissent, there is no critiquing, okay, in these more established domains, but you know, the critique is far more radical, the critique is far more strong, okay, as far as these domains are concerned. Second, cultural studies also came about as a critique of instrumental rationality. Now, instrumental rationality is you know, different from critical rationality, okay. We call we term areas or methodologies like Marxism, for instance, we label them critical rationality. Why? Because they are essentially scientific, they are essentially rational in their approach, yet they are not instrumental, okay. Rationality becomes instrumental when there is sort of a technological scientific domination, when there is a strong bureaucracy that is again based on technological and scientific domination, okay. So, cultural studies came about as a critique of instrumental rationality. It is not to say that Marxism, okay, did not critique instrumental rationality, okay. In fact, Marxism continued, okay, as a critique of instrumental rationality, and you are aware that one of you know, the most important sources of inspiration for cultural studies has been, you know, has been Marxism. We know that many scholars, for instance, in cultural materialism as given to us by or you know, the exemplars here being scholars like Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart, okay. So, one of the key inspirational forces or methodologies, epistemologies if you will, okay, has been the critique of an instrumental sort of rationality, okay. So, to sum it up, really cultural studies is seen as originating, apart from all other you know, all other reasons, also seen as originating from a dissent or a sharp criticism of instrumental rationality and a functionalist sociology. And they saw the roots of functionalist sociology and instrumental rationality, this is very important, okay, in positivistic science, okay, in positivism. Positivism was therefore held to you know, was held to be a methodology or an epistemology that was responsible for so many of the problems. For instance, even colonialism was tied to a positivistic science. Okay. Therefore, again to move on and if cultural studies looks at the particular, if cultural studies is interested and rightly so in the micro levels, okay, universals is something that comes into sharp criticism or critique from a cultural studies a methodology or a cultural studies critiquing of science and technology. Okay. So, what are the questions that we may ask, okay, after scholars scholars in science, technology and cultural studies. So, some of the important questions that we may ask are: what social, cultural, okay, please look at the slide, what social, cultural and material conditions make the universal in science possible. Okay. So, again universals in science are not viewed, as we said before, as sort of antiseptically quarantined, if I may use the word, from society, from social, cultural and material conditions. The universal itself is dependent on and takes on its nature from the material conditions of the production of science and technology. Okay. Then the second question: how do particulars become universals? Okay. The cultural studies investigation of science as in other domains, as we know, we've talked about this before, that it is interested in the particular, and this, you know, this sort of, if I may use the word, upgradation from the particular to the universal is in cultural studies viewed with a lot of suspicion. You will agree that cultural studies is perhaps, you know, we may safely say the domain that allows for, you know, a great deal of provisionality of knowledge. Okay. It is very, it has a very sharp, you know, critical eye as far as universals are concerned. Okay. In lectures, I think 3 to 5, when we in module 1, when we are talking about science and the scientific, the contribution of science, of biology to cultural studies, and certain universals. You recall that there were certain universals that were that were forwarded by scholars like David Buss, for instance, mate preference, predator avoidance, okay, language, emotions, all these were seen as universals, but, and these were then came from science, but the cultural studies investigation would again even question these so-called, you know, established universals of human beings. Next, you recall that representation is a key concept in cultural studies. We have already devoted 2 lectures to representation, and therefore, cultural studies of the universal, not only in science in this case, not only scientific universals, but you know, but also universals in the social sciences, okay, are interrogated, if we may use the word, by questioning the very strategies of representation. How is a so-called universal fact represented, right? How is now, how does it come about in the first place? We are now going, you know, after a little while, we are going to look at, you know, scholars who have said that equations, diagrams, graphs, and the written word in science are different media, and they are different strategies of representation, right? And if these media are heterogeneous, then there is a need to look at how they finally coalesce together to give a certain universal, right? Okay, so what is, we move on to the 4th point, which goes like this: what are the mechanisms by which the universal is given authority? So, after looking at the strategies, okay, after exploring the strategies of representation of the universal, then we also know that the universal is sort of legitimized, right? The universal, you know, is given authority. Now, cultural studies would look at this. How is a scientific universal, okay? What are the mechanisms by which these universals are given authority, these universals are given credulity, okay? And if, you know, eventually they are taught, they become part of canonized education, right? And finally, and not the least, because this is, I think, maybe as far as cultural studies proper is concerned, could be the most important point here. The last point: to what use is the universal put? Okay, we have a universal, we have represented it with certain strategies of representation, okay, by some social mechanisms and pedagogical mechanisms. We have made the universal canonized, we have canonized the universal, and we have given it authority, right. Finally, what, you know, this authority and power that the universal has, right, to what uses are it put? What uses are these universals, are these universals put? Okay. So, if you, if Nazi science, for instance, in the time of Hitler gave some universals, okay, some universals regarding certain races, okay, as being, you know, superior to other races, okay, then we shall have to see how those universals were created, what went into, what was the kind of science being practiced in the times of Nazism, okay, that would give rise to an idea of the ideal or the most superior among all human beings, the most superior race, which would lead also to the extermination of some races, okay, or some peoples in the world. Now, the moment I say Nazi science and the cultural exploration of Nazi science, it is easy perhaps for you to to accept it. Why? Because you knew that the the terrible excesses, okay, of Nazism were so wrong, were so very unacceptable. Okay, what is more difficult is to as scientists, you are scientists and technologists, what is more difficult is to be self-reflexive and to to look at your own work as also socially determined or also culturally determined, and also as this last point point here, being put to certain uses, right. Among I would say among not if not all, among most of the domains that you have studied so far and you are going to study in cultural studies, in this course in cultural studies, what should be of most interest and use to you, okay, is the cultural studies investigation into science and technology. So far what have we found? We have found that like STS or science, technology and society studies, also STC or science, technology and cultural studies, okay, looks at science and technology or techno science, okay, as culturally determined, culturally conditioned, socially determined, having strategies of representation, okay, there being mechanisms of giving authority and power to to science and technology, and particularly to universals, so much so that the so called universals are seen to be infallible, okay, and value neutral, right. And of course, you also have to see to what uses are these science and technology products put. So, these are essentially the key focus areas of cultural studies investigation into science and technology, right. Therefore, they come up with an important proposition like this. Cultural studies says that scientific reason too, by which or about which we have, many of us have an unfailing trust, right, which is in many ways a given to all of us, is also, now you may find this a little difficult to accept, but when we say that scientific reason is also a cultural belief, right, many would even be more radical and go on to call it a myth, right. But if it is a cultural belief, it means this, it does not mean, now this is very important, many would like so to speak to throw the baby out with the bath water and say that, oh, scientific reason is just a belief like many other things, for instance it is just a myth. But when we say that scientific reason is a cultural belief, what we mean is it is culturally and socially determined, okay, and this is something that increasingly even many scientists, right, are beginning to explore. There are these areas, these interfaces between science and philosophy, between science and sociology, between science and anthropology, and science and cultural studies. There are many scientists as well as philosophers, okay. There are also people from literature who are working in the interfaces between science and respectively all these other domains. Now, as far as the construction of identity is concerned, you know that identity and subjectivity are again two, like representation, two very important concepts. They form the key concepts among other concepts in cultural studies, and cultural studies exploration of science and technology also points to the fact that issues of identity and subjectivity of ourselves as human beings is also tied to science and technology. For instance, if we ask a question like this, what is it to be a human being? Okay. Now, there are of course, many ways of defining what a human being is, but from the point of view of science and technology, and also to a large extent, right, unless one is arguing from a religious point of view, right. From a large extent, the human being is understood increasingly in terms or in the discourse of genetics, in the discourse of general science and technology, and of course, importantly in the discourse of the medical sciences. Okay. So, what is it to be a human being? What are our subjectivities and identities? How they are carved out? These answers are increasingly being sought in, these definitions are sought in genetics, medical sciences, and science and technology. Right. This lecture would not really be complete if we did not bring in, two very important philosophers of science, okay, whose work has contributed not only to the philosophy of science, but also to to social studies of science and technology, and to cultural studies of science and technology, in the sense that they were their work was very important because they tried to shed light on science as an enterprise, okay, so on the epistemology of science, on the methodology of science. Okay, and interestingly, both Popper and Kuhn again were so different in their formulations. Okay. Now, whereas for instance, if what was the way of the traditional way of looking at science? You remember just a few slides ago we found that the traditional way, the positivistic, right, the positivistic way of looking at science, or positivistic science, considered science as progressive, as linear, okay, considered science as science is growing in in a way in which each new thing was as a given better than the previous finding. Karl Popper, as a philosopher of science, talked about falsification as the method, okay, of the narrative of science, or the method of scientific progress, and he says that science does not happen by convergence, but it happens by divergence. He says that there has to be a falsification. Your theory would have to be falsifiable in order to be deemed a science at all. Now, many find this a little paradoxical. If it is falsifiable, right, then how is it science? Okay. But Popper would say that that is in the very nature of science, and by doing this, by the falsifiability test, he was performing a very important, or making a very important contribution, particularly in when we talk about science and religion, okay, when we try and differentiate science and religion, this helps us a lot. Okay. If you look at religion, okay, religion cannot be falsified. You either believe in it, okay, or you do not. You are either a believer or you are not a believer, or in some cases you are an agnostic, which is something in between. Okay. But because religion is not falsifiable, it is not scientific. And many who do not believe in religion would then go on to say that because religion is not falsifiable, and because therefore it is not science, therefore religion cannot be knowledge. Okay, that there is a difference between knowledge and religion, between knowledge and belief, between knowledge and belief. And for something to be knowledge, you have to understand in the first place, as cultural studies would be quick to show, you would understand that it has definitely, it has to be provisional in nature, and it has to be falsifiable. Now, we come to a very important point. Just because knowledge is provisional, okay, just because science is falsifiable, does not mean that it does not work, right. There is a difference. We agree, we agree to believe or to accept the fact that science is falsifiable according to Karl Popper, and that its trajectory is a divergent one, right. We agree that science and other forms of knowledge are provisional, but we also agree at the same time that that is the best we have. Okay? Something that is put to the test and something that is reliable is something that works. Right? On the other hand, religion, because it cannot be put to the test, the belief in God is something that you either have or you do not have, you cannot put it to the test. Do you follow? Okay, in that case, many would say that it would also, it would not, not be knowledge in the first place. The other important philosopher, as you saw, was Thomas Kuhn, according to whom science progress by paradigm shifts. Okay? And if Popper talked about divergent, the trajectory being divergent of science, Kuhn referred to the trajectory of science being a convergent one, right? And he explained, the journey of science, okay, not simply as a, as a linear progressive one, where yesterday's science is better, was not better than today's science. Like Popper, whose falsification theory, made us question this old traditional linear way of looking, progressive way of looking at science. Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift also showed that there was this, that the journey of science was punctuated by, if I may use the word, punctuated by these very important shifts. For instance, if I give you an example, Newtonian mechanics would be a paradigm. Okay? The next important paradigm would be Einstein and the theory of relativity, after which, if we are to locate this, then we would have to say that it is a convergent, Kuhn believed in the convergent trajectory of science. Okay? So, we found here that Popper and Kuhn, even though they belong to, or they are important in questioning the positivist, okay, the positivist understanding of science, and they are appropriated by scholars in science and technology and society studies. The cultural studies investigation of science is deeply indebted to the work of Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. Next, there is also what is called today the critique of big science. Okay? The critique of big science. And what is big science? Big science is, big science refers to a huge or mega project in science, right? Where there are, there are scientists who belong to different parts of the world, who take up segments of the project, and the question here is the testimony being given by people so far flung in different parts of the world, okay, and their way of knowing and finally contributing to the mega project. Cultural studies or the critique of big science would look at the gaps therein. Okay. There is a trust, of course, but they would say that this very trust, which was the hallmark of science so far, okay, is something that is critique, right. So, we have mega projects in science, international projects in science, whose the gaps of knowledge, and even as people contribute, the interstices, so to speak, in them are not considered. So, let us look at a few questions here. For instance, if you get a question like delineate the scope of cultural studies of science and technology, you would answer in the following way. You would say that the cultural studies investigation of science and technology may be studied under three broad domains, and these are science as culture, okay, which lead us to talk about the cultures of science. Now, again, as I said, the cultures of science are, we do not mean scientific cultures, only scientific spirit. Okay. What we also mean are, as we understand culture in cultural studies, culture as a way of life, A, and B, the science and the codes, the encoding of codes in science. For instance, as I said, how equations and science written out in language, diagrams, right? This is what we have been through, diagrams, then graphs, okay, and what is called the activity operational, right? How these all come in together. So, there is also a sort of, you could say, a linguistic, if I may use the word, okay, a linguistic exploration of science. Finally, science and technology and the way it has shaped culture. Now, the way it has shaped culture also includes issues of identity and subjectivity, okay, how identity and subjectivity are in human beings are created. For instance, the moment you explain and define the human being as from the point of view of genetics, from the point of view of the medical sciences, okay, from the point of view of technology, then you are building a subjectivity and an identity which is increasingly informed by the findings of science and technology. Why are people increasingly doing this? People do this or have a propensity towards doing this. Why? Because science is shown to be value neutral. Okay? Science is shown to be isolated findings which are not related to, or which cannot be conditioned by science. But in the case of Newton, for instance, his Principia, we found that how it contributed to British mercantile capitalism, and at the same time was informed by it, right. Finally, last question, how does technoscience mediate subjectivity? That said, technoscience mediates subjectivity. If we ask the question, what is it to be a human being? Increasingly answers are coming from the medical sciences, from general science and technology, and from genetics. So, as with many lectures and as with many on many occasions, we have again just been able to unpack science and technology studies. My hope is many of you would go on to read important books in science and technologies. I hope that this lecture has been able to motivate you to look at your own work as scientists and technologies, to ask, to boldly accept facts that science is not value neutral, that it is deeply ensconced if not determined by society and culture. Thank you so much, and we shall meet in the next lecture.